The topic today is morality and religion. So we're going to take a look at whether or not morality depends upon religion. In other words, can you be moral and be religious? And can you be religious and be moral? And do you need one or the other, or do you need both? And so we're going to take a look at that. Currently, 90% of Americans believe in God. Compare that to 71% of Canadians and 52% of the British. Even Denmark and Sweden, only about 20%. So when you look at those numbers, you see that the United States is unusually religious. Now, of course, it's difficult to measure religion in anyone because it's very difficult to even define what does that mean. But regardless, in our society, at least, priests and ministers are assumed to be very wise counselors to give you sound advice when it is needed, and usually that's moral advice. Why? Is it because priests and ministers are morally superior? Are they wiser? No, simply because morality and religion are seen to be inseparable in our culture. Most people assume that morality can be understood, at least in part, if not completely, in the context of religion. So priests and ministers and pastors would therefore be the experts. We do see that there are important connections between morality and religion. Many people's moral motivations are strengthened through their religion. Their religion gives them the motivation, gives them the reason to be what many would consider moral. They also provide guidance in the form of rules and principles, and oftentimes very simplified or unified principles. They set higher standards for morality than what might be even seen in regular society and what is customary. Religions also make claims justifying or grounding morality, usually by appealing to an authority figure, whether that be God, Allah, whatever that might be. And religions can be open to moral criticism as well. And so there's a connection there. Some of their practices, their doctrines, have been in history criticized on moral grounds as well. So there are some connections between religion and morality. We're going to take a look at a couple of different theories that are also outlined in your textbook to see if we can make that connection between religion and morality, or are there any flaws? And so we're always looking, remember, to decide how do you live the best and most worthwhile life, and does that include a religious basis? So that's what we're going to be looking at throughout this chapter. So let's start with the divine command theory, or DCT. The idea is that God is conceived of the lawgiver who lays down the rules that we are to obey. So being morally right is a matter of being commanded by God. Being morally wrong is about being forbidden by God. So the idea here is that it's morally right if God commands it, it's morally wrong if God forbids it. So, sometimes we say, well, why do people worry about this at all? Who cares if God commands it or God forbids it? And why don't we just do what is in our own self-interest? Well, according to the divine command theory, there's a day of final reckoning, a day that you're going to be held accountable. And if that in fact is true, and you believe that to be true, of course you would want to be on the right side of the fence, so to speak. If you're going to be held accountable for your actions, you want to make sure that those actions are going to get you the most favorable light on that day of final reckoning. So let's start with this. Okay, if divine command theory is about being commanded by God or forbidden by God, one of the questions that Plato asks in early Greek philosophy is conduct right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is right? And I want you to think about that for a minute, because there's a lot in that statement. According to divine command theory, nothing's either right or wrong or good or bad except when God's thinking makes it so. So, for example, in Exodus, God commands us to be truthful. Aside from divine command theory, truth-telling is neither right nor wrong, good nor bad. It's God's command that makes truthfulness right. So that's kind of mysterious. How does God make it? It's not something that, it's not like building a sandcastle or making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But it's still very mysterious to us. How can this be done? No one knows. How can merely saying or commanding that something is right make it right? The other issue is that sometimes these commands are very arbitrary, right, under this conception of morality. God commanded us to be truthful, but couldn't he have just as easily commanded us to lie? So that's really hard for us to understand as well. And maybe there are more reasons why we should or should not do things besides just that God commanded us. Now, this is definitely not saying that this isn't right or wrong, but I think it's important to think critically about these issues in morality in religion. There might be many reasons why something might be wrong. For example, I think your author talks about child abuse. Are there other reasons why child abuse is wrong other than God commanding that child abuse is wrong? And I would venture to say yes. It's malicious. It causes pain. There's maybe long-term undesirable psychological effects. Under divine command theory, none of those reasons are utilized. It's just that God commanded it wrong. So it's something to think about. Are there other reasons? If God didn't exist, would child abuse be wrong? And the other thing to think about is sometimes religious texts and religious officials also disagree about and are inconsistent about what is right or wrong. So I think it's also important to ask the question, could a person be in doubt of what God really wants or what God is really saying? So I think there's lots of things to think about when we think about, is conduct right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is right? Now, let's jump forward. And Socrates also looked at this question and said, God commands us to do certain things because they are right. If we think about that, then what this is saying is that God is wise, and he recognizes, or she recognizes, that truthfulness is better than deceitfulness, for example. So he commands us to be truthful. He sees that killing is wrong, so he forbids us to kill. But the problem is that once we do this, we're recognizing a standard of right or wrong that is really independent of God's will. The rightness then must exist prior to God's command, which brings out a whole another issue. If rightness and wrongness exist prior to God, and God is just the mere recognizer of what is right and what is wrong, then who did create right and wrong? So it's tricky. It's very tricky, but definitely something to think about. The other theory is about natural law. So aside from divine command theory, we have this theory of natural law, which states, and we can look back to Aristotle for this one, the idea that the world has a rational order with values and purposes built into its very nature. And in other words, everything in nature has a purpose. So like many Christian thinkers, they agreed with Aristotle. They liked the idea that the world had a rational order, but of course, Aristotle didn't put God into that, so they felt they needed to add God to make it complete. So it's the idea that everything has a purpose because that is what God intended, right? That's the way God wanted to. In other words, everything is created with a divine plan, right? So the law of nature describes not only how things are, but also how things ought to be, right? Things are how they ought to be when they are serving their natural purpose, right? Including morals and moral behavior, right? So when we look and we say, okay, our moral views are derived from this thing called natural law, it's the idea that when things then are not serving their natural purpose, they are said to be unnatural, and unnatural things are wrong. So you get the idea of what is right and what is wrong morally. If things are serving their rational intended purpose, their natural purpose, they would be considered morally correct. If things are not serving their natural purpose, in other words, they are unnatural, they are not correct, or they are immoral. Now, this is a theory that the Catholic Church has used for some time, the theory based on natural law. However, today, there's probably not as many true advocates of natural law theory for a couple of different reasons. One being that under natural law, if you think, okay, what is natural is good. Well, sometimes that's open to counter-argument. Sometimes what is natural may not be good. If you look at natural disasters, hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, fires, disease, those things may be natural, but there are many people who would argue that they are not good. So it sort of puts a kink in the idea that what is natural is good. The other thing I think we probably should think about is that just because something does have a purpose doesn't mean that they don't have more than one purpose. And let me give you an example. So, for instance, we know that sex does produce babies, right? If you have intercourse, there is a possibility that you could become pregnant, have babies, but it doesn't follow that sex ought to or ought not to be engaged in only for that purpose. That's not a logical jump, right? So I think there's things to look at when we're looking at the theory of natural law as well. You know, the natural laws that we that specify what we should do are laws of reason. So we can grasp them because God made us rational beings. Without the power to understand that order, we would have a much harder time determining what was right and what is wrong. So, you know, we're looking at where do we get this moral knowledge, right? So natural law endorses the fact that we should do whatever has the best reasons on its side. So what does that mean? Well, if God has given us the ability to reason and do whatever has the best reason on its side, then we have to ask the question, if that is true of everyone, then the religious believer really has no special access to moral truth, right? The believer and the non-believer are then in the same position with this ability to be rational and to think with reason. If God both gave them both rationality, then why does the believer of the religion, the religious believer, is better off morally than the non-believer if they both have the ability to be rational and have rationality? Really, the only difference here is that the non-believer doesn't necessarily realize that God is the author of this order in which they participate. So, what does that mean? That religion or religious belief does not calculate necessarily what is best if we have the ability to reason and be rational on ourselves. So that sort of leaves morality independent of religion. And so I like to ask the question, can religious people be moral? Yes. Can religious people be immoral? Yes. Can non-religious people be moral? Yes. Can non-religious people be immoral? So where does that then leave religion? If you can be a non-religious person and still be moral or immoral, do you need to have religion for morality? I'm not saying that you do or you don't. I just am asking the question. And even when we do ask the question, and if we realize that religion is needed in morality, then which religion? How do we know which one is the best one? How do we know which one to follow? How do we know which scripture to follow, right? If we find our moral guidance through scripture, through the Bible, through the Torah, through the Quran, then does that apply to us now? Are the problems that faced early Jews and Christians the same problems that are facing us today, and are those addressed in the scripture? I think that's valid to ask. Are those scriptures ambiguous? Is it possible that church authorities disagree on them? Could it be that individuals make up their own mind about what is moral and then they look to the scriptures to find passages or substance to back them up? All of that, I think, is possible and worth thinking about. So I think when we ask the question, do you need religion to be moral, you have to think of some of these questions. maybe you do need religion to be moral. And maybe there's good, valid reasons, but I think that it is